The hospital room fell silent, except for the mechanical beep of machines, keeping 8-year-old Lucas Harrison alive. And in that terrible quiet, his mother's whispered prayer, "Please, someone save my baby," seemed to dissolve into the sterile air like smoke, unheard by the 10 specialists who stood around his bed with faces that had given up hope. Martha Williams stood in the corner of the private hospital suite, her weathered hands clutching a worn Bible and a small cloth bear she'd retrieved from Lucas's bedroom, watching the scene unfold with a breaking heart. She'd worked for the Harrison family for 12 years, cleaning their 30-room mansion, preparing their meals, and quietly loving the golden-haired boy who was now slipping away. And though she was surrounded by people, she'd never felt more invisible in her life. It had started 3 days ago, when Lucas collapsed during his birthday party, surrounded by 200 guests, crystal chandeliers, and a chocolate fountain taller than most men. And while everyone assumed he'd just overexerted himself, he never woke up his father, Richard Harrison, a tech billionaire worth $43 billion, had immediately transformed an entire wing of St. Catherine's Hospital into a private medical facility, flying in specialists from Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic, and Geneva, neurologists and toxicologists and infectious disease experts who ran every test modern medicine could offer. But Lucas's condition only worsened, his vitals dropping slowly, his small chest rising and falling with mechanical assistance, and his parents' aged years in mere days. Dr. Reeves, the lead neurologist with silver hair and 30 years of experience, stood at the foot of Lucas's bed, reviewing scans for the 100th time. His confidence from day one completely evaporated, replaced by the hollow eyes of a man confronting the limits of his knowledge. And he exchanged glances with Dr. Patel, the toxicologist who'd ruled out every poison, venom, and contaminate known to science, while Mrs. Harrison Carolyn sat beside her son's bed, in a designer dress now rumpled from 3 days of wear, holding his small hand and weeping silently, no longer the commanding socialite who chaired 5 charity boards, but simply a mother watching her child die. Richard Harrison stood by the window, overlooking the city his technology had helped build, his phone dark for the first time in a decade, his empire meaningless, his hands pressed against the glass as if he could push through it and escape this nightmare. And Martha watched him with an emotion she couldn't quite name, not quite pity, not quite satisfaction, but something closer to recognition, because she'd lost a child too, 15 years ago, her daughter Maya, who'd died of leukemia in a county hospital ward with flickering lights and overworked nurses. And she'd learned then that money couldn't buy the only things that truly mattered, though she'd never imagined the Harrisons would learn the same lesson. The doctors convened in hushed tones near the door, and Martha heard fragments of their defeat, unprecedented neurological decline, no identifiable pathogen, possibly genetic. "We've done everything." And she saw Dr. Reeves, preparing to have the conversation no parent should hear, the one about saying goodbye and making final arrangements, and something in Martha's chest caught fire. She'd been watching Lucas since the moment they brought him in, not with medical instruments, but with the eyes of someone who'd bathed him as a toddler, who'd sat with him through nightmares when his parents were in Tokyo or London or Dubai, who'd taught him to tie his shoes and listened to his stories about dragons and spaceships. And she'd noticed something that gnawed at her trained instincts, the way his left hand occasionally twitched, always the left, always in a specific pattern, and how his eyes moved rapidly beneath his closed lids, not randomly, but as if tracking something, and most importantly, the faint, almost imperceptible smell that clung to him, sweet and chemical, and familiar in a way that triggered memories she couldn't quite grasp. Martha had learned long ago to stay silent in rooms full of important people, to be the wallpaper, the furniture, the help she'd been dismissed, talked over, and ignored so many times that invisibility had become her armor, and speaking up now, contradicting 10 of the world's finest doctors, could mean her job, her dignity, the fragile respect she'd carefully cultivated. But as she watched Dr. Reeves approach Caroline with his practiced sympathetic expression, Martha thought of Maya, of how she'd been voiceless in her daughter's final days, shuffled aside by medical professionals who didn't have time for a poor single mother's questions. And she made a decision that terrified her. "Excuse me," Martha said, her voice barely above a whisper. And predictably, no one heard her, so she stepped forward from her corner, her heart pounding, and said louder, "Excuse me, please." And the room slowly turned to look at her with expressions ranging from confusion to irritation, and Dr. Reeves said with barely concealed impatience, "Ma'am, this is a private medical consultation. If you could please wait outside." But Martha stood her ground, her knees shaking beneath her simple blue dress, and said, "I know what's wrong with Lucas." The room erupted in uncomfortable silence, the kind that pressed against eardrums, and Richard Harrison turned from the window, seeing Martha truly, seeing her perhaps for the first time, despite her 12 years of service. And he said, not unkindly but with the exhaustion of a man grasping at straws, "Martha, these are the best doctors in the world. I don't think," but Caroline, still holding Lucas's hand, looked at Martha with eyes that held a mother's desperate mathematics, the calculation that any chance, no matter how small, was worth taking, and she said, "Let her speak." Martha moved closer to the bed, aware of 10 pairs of professional eyes judging her, and she said, 3 weeks ago, Lucas started a new hobby. He's been growing plants in his room. A science project about botany." And Dr. Reeves interrupted, "We're aware. We checked for allergies and environmental factors. There's nothing," but Martha pressed on, her voice stronger now, "not just any plants. He ordered special seeds online, exotic ones. And there's one plant on his windowsill. Beautiful purple flowers. He was so proud of it. Called it his angel trumpet." And she watched as Dr. Patel's face suddenly changed, his eyes widening, and he said, "Angel trumpet. Do you mean And Martha nodded. "Yes, that sounds right. He showed me the label. He'd been taking care of it for 2 weeks, watering it every morning, and the day before his birthday, I saw him touching the flowers, smelling them. He had the pollen all over his hands." Dr. Patel grabbed Dr. Reeves's arm and said urgently, "Scopolamine atropine, hyoscyamine brugmansia, contains tropane alkaloids. We didn't test for it because it's so rare, but the symptoms fit the neurological depression, the mydriasis we noted in his pupils, the delirium," and suddenly the room exploded into action. Doctors rushing to order new tests, nurses called in for specific antidotes, and Martha stepped back into her corner, trembling, while Caroline stared at her with an expression of wonder and horror, realizing that the answer had been in her own home all along, visible to the woman who actually spent time in her son's bedroom, who noticed his interests and listened to his excited explanations, while she and Richard had been too busy building empires and attending galas. The next 6 hours moved like a film, and fast forward the toxicology team confirmed dangerous levels of tropane alkaloids in Lucas's system. The antidote was administered, atropine sulfate and supportive care, and slowly, miraculously, Lucas's vitals began to stabilize, his brain activity normalized, and just after midnight, his eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused but alive, and Caroline collapsed over his bed, sobbing while Richard stood frozen by the window, his face wet with tears he didn't bother to hide. Martha had quietly excused herself during the flurry of medical activity, returning to what she knew, the background. But 2 days later, when Lucas was fully conscious and eating solid food, asking for his mother and his iPad, and complaining about the hospital food in the way only a recovering child can, Richard Harrison came to the staff kitchen, where Martha was preparing to leave her shift, and he stood in the doorway of this room he'd probably never entered, this billionaire in his $1,000 suit, and he said, "You saved my son's life." And Martha, uncomfortable with direct attention, said, "I just noticed something, that's all." The doctors did the saving. But Richard crossed the small room and did something that shocked Hurry, took her hands in his. This man who barely shook hands with anyone outside his social tier. And he said, "No, you saw him, really saw him. You knew his world, his interests, the details of his life, and I didn't." His own father didn't know about his plants, his science project. I couldn't name a single thing that makes him excited, and that ignorance almost cost me everything. The conversation that followed was halting and awkward. Two people from different worlds, trying to bridge a canyon of class and experience. But Richard asked Martha about Lucas, really asked, and she told him about Lucas's love of astronomy, his kindness to injured birds, his fear of thunderstorms, his questions about why some people had so much and others so little. Questions that Martha had answered carefully while his parents were in Paris or Milan. And Richard listened with the dawning horror of a man realizing he'd been living in his own house like a stranger. And he said, "I've been so focused on building his future that I forgot to be present in his present. And we've treated you like furniture, like you're invisible, when you've been more of a parent to him then." But his voice broke. And Martha, despite everything, despite years of being overlooked and undervalued, felt compassion for this broken man learning a terrible lesson. When Lucas was released from the hospital a week later, the Harrison family returned to their mansion on Bellevue Avenue, but something fundamental had shifted, like a building settling on a new foundation. Richard canceled 3 international trips and started having breakfast with Lucas every morning, asking him about his interests, his dreams, his fears, actually listening instead of checking his phone. And Caroline cleared her calendar of society luncheons to spend afternoons with her son, discovering that she enjoyed playing chess with him more than she'd ever enjoyed. Champagne receptions with people whose names she barely remembered. Martha noticed these changes from her usual invisible position, pleased but not quite believing they would last. Cynicism born from decades of watching wealthy families perform temporary gratitude before returning to their patterns. But then Richard did something unexpected. He called a family meeting and asked Martha to join them in the living room. Not to serve, but to sit. And when she hesitated at the doorway, Lucas, still pale but smiling, jumped up and took her hand, leading her to the sofa, saying, "Martha, Dad says you're the hero who saved me. He says your family," and the word hung in the air like a bell tone. Richard stood before them, this man accustomed to boardroom presentations, now struggling with a more important speech, and he said, "Martha, I've asked you here because we owe you more than gratitude. We owe you honesty for 12 years. You've worked in our home, cared for our son, kept our lives running, and we've treated you as invisible. We've never asked about your life, your family, your dreams. We've reduced you to a function, and I'm ashamed." And Caroline, sitting beside Lucas with her arm around him, nodded with tears in her eyes and said, "When you spoke up in that hospital room, despite all the doctors, despite knowing we might dismiss you, you risked everything for our son. And I realized that you've been doing that all along, caring for him, protecting him, loving him, while we were absent, and I don't know how to make that right, but I want to try." Martha felt her own eyes burning. Emotions she'd kept carefully locked away for years, threatening to overflow, and she said, her voice thick, "I loved Maya, my daughter. I lost her when she was 7, leukemia, and I couldn't save her. I didn't have the resources, the access, the voice. And when I came to work for you, Lucas was just a baby, and maybe I shouldn't have. But I let myself love him too, not to replace Maya, but because children deserve to be loved, to be seen. And I saw him even when I knew you didn't see me, and I'm not saying that for pity. I'm just saying that loving him was never a burden, it was a gift." Lucas, who'd been listening with the solemn intensity of a child processing adult emotions, turned to Martha and said, "You had a daughter. What was her name?" And Martha smiled through tears and said, "Maya, Her name was Maya, and Lucas said, "Did she like stars too?" I could have shared my telescope, and the simple, earnest generosity of the statement broke something open in the room. And suddenly, Caroline was crying, and Richard had to turn away. And Martha pulled Lucas into a hug, this child who wasn't hers, but who she'd loved like her own. The following weeks brought changes that rippled through the Harrison household like stones in water. Richard established a foundation in Maya's name, funding pediatric cancer research and treatment for families who couldn't afford care, the kind of care Martha never had access to, and he asked Martha to help direct it, valuing her perspective, her experience, her voice that had been silent for too long. Carolyn started actually talking to Martha, asking about her life, learning that she wrote poetry, that she dreamed of publishing a book someday, and Caroline, who sat on the board of a publishing house, offered to help, not out of charity, but out of genuine interest, reading Martha's work and discovering talent that had been invisible to her before. Lucas insisted that Martha eat dinner with the family, not serve it, and though Martha resisted at first, uncomfortable with breaking such ingrained boundaries, Lucas's persistence and genuine desire for her presence eventually won out, and she found herself at the Harrison table 3 nights a week, sharing meals and conversation, her opinions sought and valued, and slowly, carefully, she allowed herself to believe that maybe this transformation was real. Maybe people could change. Maybe being seen after years of invisibility could actually happen. The mansion on Bellevue Avenue became a different place, not in its physical structure, but in its spirit. Richard learned that wealth without presence was poverty of a different kind, that his son didn't need another toy or trip to Europe, but needed him. His attention, his time, his genuine interest. Caroline discovered that significance didn't come from social status, but from authentic connection, from being present in the small moments, from valuing people for who they were rather than what they could do for her image. Lucas, young as he was, learned that the people around him were not invisible. That kindness meant seeing others, really seeing them, and that sometimes the most important person in the room was the one everyone else overlooked. 6 months after the hospital, on a Sunday afternoon with autumn light streaming through the tall windows, the Harrison family and Martha sat in the garden where Lucas's controversial angel trumpet plant had been carefully removed and replaced with a safer variety of flowers, and Lucas, fully recovered and energetic as ever, presented Martha with a gift, a leather-bound book with her name embossed in gold, and when she opened it with trembling hands, she found her own poems printed on cream-colored pages, professionally typeset and beautiful. The first edition of a collection Caroline had helped her publish, and Lucas said, "Now everyone can see you, Martha, just like you saw me." Richard stood and raised a glass of lemonade in an informal toast, and he said, "To Martha, who taught us that the most valuable things in life are often right in front of us, invisible only because we're not really looking, and who reminded us that every person deserves to be seen, to be heard, to be valued, regardless of their position or title, and who saved more than my son's life. She saved our family, our humanity, our chance to be better than we were," and they all raised their glasses. This unlikely family bound not by blood, but by crisis, transformation, and the choice to see each other truly. Martha looked at the faces around her, Lucas, grinning with juice on his chin, Carolyn smiling with genuine warmth, Richard with eyes that had learned to focus on what mattered, and she thought of Maya, wondering if somehow her daughter's brief life and tragic death had led her here, to this moment, to this second chance at family. And while the pain of loss never fully disappeared, she felt something she hadn't felt in 15 years, peace, and the knowledge that being seen, after a lifetime of invisibility, was its own kind of miracle. The sun set over the garden, casting long shadows across the grass, and in the golden light of that autumn evening, 4 people sat together, talking and laughing, their positions and differences not erased, but transformed into something more beautiful: mutual respect, genuine love, and the hard-won understanding that wisdom and worth are not determined by wealth or education, but by the willingness to see, to listen, and to value every human life, especially those the world has taught us to overlook, because sometimes the person everyone ignores is the one who sees most clearly, and sometimes it takes almost losing everything to finally open our eyes.